Thanks everyone for joining. We're still see a lot of folks coming in, but want to be mindful of everyone's time and make the most of the hour we have together. So we'll get started with some introductions as folks trickle in, and then get started with the real content in a couple minutes. So thank you all for joining our introduction to nonprofit scenario planning webinar hosted in collaboration with the Bridgespan Group. I see a lot of familiar names and faces in the attendees. But for anyone I haven't met, my name is John Hoffman. I'm the Director of Assessment Navigation with Elevate NP of Southwestern Pennsylvania. For those of you who don't already know us, Elevate NP is a collaborative initiative to create a stable, better connected, more accessible network of capacity building resources for mission-driven organizations across the 12 counties of Southwestern Pennsylvania. We focus on building on the existing assets that are in our communities, filling gaps in service where they exist, and connecting nonprofit organizations to really high quality, effective solutions to maximize their community impact. Elevate NP came together after input from hundreds of nonprofit professionals over the last couple of years, and capacity builders and funders and the community at large to really understand what's working well in capacity building, but also where there are some persistent challenges in our system that we could help to improve on. We know it can be hard to find the right high quality resources to support your organization. So we're building a navigation team to help organizations understand where they're starting from, what they need, and get connected to the right resources to meet the moment. We know that financial management and fundraising are really enduring challenges. And so we've launched some pilot programming there, a shared financial services team, and a series of fundraising training resources to help meet those needs. We know that finding, keeping, and managing the right people can be challenging, both on staff and in governance. And so we're looking at building programming and collaboration in that space in the year to come. But we also know that the urgency of the moment really needs to take priority. There's so much uncertainty and so much change right now in the funding landscape, in the policy and political landscape, in the economy, in the world at large. We've heard this loud and clear over the last couple months. So, in the spirit of both building on existing assets, on having really high quality solutions, and in really trying to meet the moment, that's what brings us here today for this webinar and this series. I'm excited to introduce Mike, Amma, and Vlad from the Bridgespan Group for today's webinar. This is the first in a series of programming around adaptive strategy. Bridgespan's really a national leader in this area, and we're super excited to have them bringing their tools and expertise to our region.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. We're really thrilled to be here with you all. My name is Mike Ciccarone. I'm a partner with the Bridgespan Group, joined by Vlad and Ama. The three of us are based out of our Boston office, and we spend most of our time supporting nonprofit leaders like you all in navigating strategic choices and opportunities. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. We know your time is very precious, and so we'll hope you find this content and our discussion this afternoon really helpful and actionable as you think about just navigating the uncertainty that's going on in the world around us while you try to deliver on your mission. A quick word about the Bridgespan Group. We're a global nonprofit organization that collaborates with mission-driven leaders, organizations, and philanthropists to make the world more equitable and just. One way we do this is by providing tools and content free of charge for social sector leaders and funders to strengthen their organizations and practices, and to encourage more funding to flow towards social change and equity. We also offer philanthropic and nonprofit consulting services and capacity building support for nonprofit leadership teams. We're a global organization. We have offices in the places you see at the bottom of the page, and the three of us today are based in our Boston office. Just a little housekeeping before we dive into our content. First, this webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording with you by email afterwards, and the slides and links to some of the resources that you might find helpful. And then any questions you have, we'll use both the Q&A feature here in Zoom if you have questions on the content, and we'll come back to that towards the end of the hour to look at those questions and talk through them. And there'll be a few places we'll also prompt you all in the chat to engage. So just to test out the chat right now, would love if people could just put in where are you dialing in from? What's your organization and where in the world are you? Would love to have that in the chat and we can say hello to everyone. And then finally, lastly, we'd love your feedback after the webinar. Please complete the post-webinar survey that you'll get after this. Awesome and so fun to see the people from Pittsburgh and the surrounding region. Really excited to dig into some of this work with you all. Welcome. So why are we here? Since Inauguration Day, the new administration has pushed forward a slate of executive orders, funding freezes, decisions that reduced the federal workforce, and in turn created significant impact for nonprofits on the national and global scale. These actions are targeting many issues that you all work with, topics like immigration, diversity, equity, and inclusion, climate, gender, public health, education. The list really goes on. And the nonprofit sector as a whole has been under increased scrutiny, including actions specifically targeting NGOs and nonprofits. This is impacting our work in lots of different ways. At the organization and team level, we know that many of you all are experiencing blocks and delays in your funding. You're concerned about heightened scrutiny and potential risk. Many of you are facing tough choices already, given budget cuts or potential cuts to funding. And you're also thinking hard about just how to communicate and run your programming in a way that meets the needs of the communities you serve in a time when those needs are rapidly changing based on everything in the external landscape. And on top of that, at a personal level, nonprofit leaders are probably a little more stressed than usual this year, given all of these changes. And so navigating that on a personal level as a leader and how to continue leading towards your mission in a way that's most effective is definitely top of mind. Meanwhile, these actions being rolled out across the federal government and trickling down, they're varying. Some are being moved forward really quickly into implementation. Some are being challenged in court. And so just the day-to-day landscape is honestly confusing and continuing to fluctuate. And literally things are changing every day where there's new unexpected headlines, expected things. And so it's really, really a moment where the one thing we can be certain of is that it's going to be uncertain for a while. So with all of that, that's why we're here. And in moments like this, one of the ways we find powerful to manage a situation is to step back and do some thoughtful scenario planning to think about how are you going to navigate the uncertainty ahead and do so with a bit of confidence. And maybe even in the face of navigating risks, identify opportunities for even greater impact in ways to move your organization forward. We've been doing this sort of work throughout our history. We were founded in 2020, and there's been various moments of uncertainty like this one in the past, not least of which everything that happened in 2020. But this moment's even, I think, different because how all these changes are hitting different organizations across the sector is different. So it's even a bit more complicated. Today, we're going to walk through a framework and tool that we've used with many, many nonprofits to help them build sound, actionable scenario plans in tough times. And really, they're a way to think strategically about choices and decisions. We'll try to make this interactive and encourage you to be active in the chat and submit questions in the Q&A, which we'll come back to again at the end with some time that we've built in. At the end, we'll also share some tools and resources to help you and your organization with scenario planning. And just I'll say, we know our tools aren't the only ones on this topic. And if there's other tools you found that are helpful, we'd love for you to add those into the chat and we'll prompt you for that as well at the end. So let's dive in. Would love to hear from you. What are some of the key risks and opportunities and uncertainties that your organization is facing right now? And what likely motivated you to join the webinar today? What are some of the, at least one of the key risks or uncertainties you're facing today? Let's see that in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on the funding front. And then questions about, as funding changes, what might we do to stay focused on the greatest impact we can have? If we have to make hard trade-offs, which things are going to have the most impact? Which things internally do we really need to protect because they're so important for our organization in order to deliver on our work? So super helpful. I see a lot of points on funding and then the ripple effects from that. I also see some points about, the communities you all serve facing increased pressure and stress and targeting, which is definitely there as well. Great point from Ria just on whether having an explicit racial equity focus could lead to jeopardizing your 501(c)(3) status, which is still a live question. So this is really, really helpful, and I think you guys are laying out the broad range of issues. And we'll try to touch on some of these as we go. So when we think about scenario planning in the face of all of these changes and challenges, simply put, it's a way to put a structure around the key decisions that you might have to make in this time of uncertainty. It's first about naming what are the most important things, the key drivers of your work that might be at risk, as well as maybe opportunities. And then thinking about how that uncertainty might lead to different scenarios, different versions of the future, and coming up with a plan, a portfolio of potential actions to help you navigate each scenario. I'll say that in our experience, the process is as powerful as the plan because going through this process and iterating and doing it again and again builds time for listening and reflection. And that's really important when you're being bombarded with all of this information that's so overwhelming and sometimes daunting. It's about taking an opportunity to really shift from being reactive to all of those external changes and adopt a more proactive approach. There's a lot of value we find in laying these things out ahead of time, especially because if you then, in short order, find yourself in a worst case scenario, you and everyone around you is going to be feeling even more anxiety and stress. And so before you come to that point, it's really an ideal time to be thinking about what actions might we take in those future scenarios in a period of relative calm, which is funny to call this a period of relative calm, but in some ways it is. We've broken down scenario planning into 4 steps, and we're going to walk through these this afternoon. Step 1 is about identifying the key drivers of your impact and economics within programs, funding, other categories, and assessing which of those are most at risk. Step 2 is about then using that assessment and combining that potentially with external data about what's happening or likely to happen to come up with a few scenarios about how the impact of those risks might then affect your organization and community, and really trying to get to best case, moderate case, worst case scenarios. In step 3, we talk about creating a portfolio of actions and the options that'll help your organization manage against those most likely scenarios. And then finally, step 4, thinking about the trigger points. What are the things you'll look for in the external world that'll prompt you on when to take those actions? At the center, you see this process itself takes iteration and ongoing incorporating new data and information as it becomes available. But the goal is to lay an initial groundwork up front with a clear sense of what are the big scenarios we might find ourselves in, and if we find themselves in them, what actions will we take? And then direct more of your energy towards the day-to-day work, the decision-making and execution that follows. So we'll talk about these in turn. Before that, I also want to just touch on one idea, and it's the idea of guiding principles that can also be helpful when you're going into an exercise like this. You see here an example of some guiding principles, and we find these can be really powerful. They can serve a couple of functions. First, they can just help you make faster and more consistent decisions if you and your leadership team and your board have agreed on the set of things that's going to guide your hard decisions in the face of all this uncertainty. They can be a set of shared criteria that help you get clear on the trade-offs you might have to make in advance. And then secondly, having clarity at the level of these kind of guiding principles can help you talk about the decisions in a way that explains why you decided what you decided and the values behind them. And hopefully that instills confidence and trust with your team and your board and your stakeholders. It can be especially powerful if you have to make a hard decision that not everyone's helpful with, to be able to point to something that you did all agree upon were the guiding principles and values you were going to hold close as an organization. A few things to point out on this example. First, just on the left, we've got big categories, and on the right, have some specific examples of guiding principles. And you might think about creating a list like this for your own organization. If, say, protecting the mission resonates with you, you might think about really what does that mean? In the case here, finding ways to safely and effectively continue your core programs for the communities you serve, say. That might then guide you if you're in a place where you have to make some hard cuts in terms of prioritizing which programs are most core to your mission versus which things in a worst case you might have to cut. I'll just say I know many of you probably already have stated values and even things like guiding principles, and often we find those are a really valuable starting point for a list like this, but it can also be worth taking those out and looking at them in light of, are these the same guiding principles that will guide us as we make hard decisions in the changing world. And sometimes another conversation is worth it to refine those for this purpose. So let's get into some of the details. My colleague Amma and I are going to walk through each of those four steps and share some examples. And so Amma, over to you for step one.
Thanks, Mike. So the first step here in scenario planning is identifying the biggest drivers of your organization's impact and economics that are facing the highest levels of uncertainty and risk. And many of these you've already shared in chat. These are the elements or variables that animate your day or keep you up at night, and they typically fall into three categories: programs, operations, and funding. For example, from a programming perspective, you'll want to understand which programs or service offerings are core to your mission and which are responsible for driving the greatest impact across the greatest number of people or issues. You'll also want to identify the ways in which this programming has or could evolve due to changing needs. Then, from an operational perspective, you'll want to think about the biggest cost drivers within your organization and articulate the ways they may need to shift going forward. You'll also want to consider potential legal or reputational risks that could put in jeopardy your ability to operate. And from a funding perspective, it's important to ground in your biggest sources of revenue. So these might be philanthropic funding, government funding, earned revenue, et cetera. And you'll want to understand what level of uncertainty and risk is associated with each. The big tip that we'd highlight here is not to get distracted by the small stuff. So here, it's really important to focus on the most important aspects of your organization facing the highest levels of risk. So in scenario planning, clarity is more important than complexity.
And here's an example of what that might look like. Amma and I'll ping pong back and forth with each step and some examples. In this step one, identifying those key drivers of risk, it can be helpful to really just lay out these are the big risks we might face, and then assess how likely are they to occur, low, medium, high, and if they do, what's the magnitude of them? How big a risk is it, low, medium, high? And if you do this, then you can prioritize the smaller set of things in this crazy swirling world that you're going to dig in on to think about for your scenario planning. For example, within programs, you might ask yourself questions like, how is this unfolding world going to change the needs of the people we serve? Or whether impending policy decisions might meaningfully impact the program approach you take, your ability to pursue specific programs and their legality. You might also dig into whether external partners you work with might face meaningful risks that could then directly impact you. Within operations, you might weigh the things you see here, things like the threat of legal action against your organization, or one that I saw some examples of in the chat, whether some of your staff or program participants might be differentially impacted by the current environment, and maybe they need unique supports in this time. And then on the funding front, you might think through how are our big funding streams, philanthropy, government, other, how are they facing risks right now, and what might be the magnitude if some of those were scaled back. You'll notice in this example, not every row is highlighted. I think the point is to get a view of the full list of risks and opportunities that you're facing, and then do some prioritizing. Which things are most likely to occur, and if they do, are going to be the biggest deal, and then focus in your work on that. And that, again, gets to some of the simplicity that Amma was just talking about. And now let's turn to that. What do you do once you've identified these big areas of risk?
So in step two, this involves developing the best, moderate, and worst case scenarios that reflect the full spectrum of possible outcomes for your organization. So you'll build these scenarios around two things. One is the key drivers of organizational impact and economics facing high levels of risk that you've developed in the previous. And then you'll also consider the few most outside of your control that directly impact you. For example, scenarios, you'll model their related impact on your budget using the time horizon that's most appropriate for your organization. So many of you are likely working to scenario plan. Pay attention to here. It's really important to remember that getting the scenarios right or perfect is not the goal. What's important is that you and your team do your best to map the full range of potential outcomes. And then the other thing to highlight here is don't underestimate that worst case scenario. It is important to prepare for that metaphorical 100-year flood. And ultimately, this exercise of developing scenarios will help tee up a set of important, really practical conversations about what actions and options your leadership team should consider if different futures unfold. And what this could actually look like, I'll pass it to Mike to walk through a hypothetical example for a nonprofit.
Thanks, Emma. And so here you could imagine if this organization, a community health nonprofit, went through that broad list of risks and opportunities and identified the ones that were highest likelihood and highest magnitude if they come to pass. Then the next step is to sit and think through, well, what would be the best case, moderate case, and worst case in each of those? So if you just take the bottom row for an example, an analysis of funding risk for an organization like that, in a best case, maybe there's no change in grant commitments. In a moderate case, maybe there's some cuts to funding, in particular, a vulnerable grant for serving migrant populations, which seems like it's likely to be affected. And then in the worst case, you could see total cuts to a key grant and a reduction in program funding. Some other examples you could imagine across the top, the range of patient experiences, where in the best case, the patients might just be experiencing some external stresses, and so you might lose some patients. And as you move to the right, the severity of that could change. In an extreme scenario, you might lose patients because they themselves are losing funding sources and you're losing funding sources, and so you don't have the ability to serve them anymore. In the landscape of external partners, this organization's patients could also engage with. The best case might be no impact, but in a worst case, the other nonprofits, those organizations that your same patients go to, they might shut down, leading to a dramatic increase in patient need and then an increased burden on your programs. In some cases, you might be able to even quantify the impact in each scenario. For example, what are the total dollars we might lose? What would be the total impact on patient volumes for this nonprofit? And that can also be helpful. Again, not an exact science, but just to get a ballpark of largely what do we think the worst case is. And if you get to, a version of that that's 80% correct, that's more helpful than being in a place of it being totally unknown. So once you've described the impact of the scenarios, thought about how that's going to play out, you're ready to move to step 3.
So, after modeling the impact of that spectrum of scenarios you've created, this step is about developing the set of potential actions you could take to manage against these scenarios. So, in other words, what actions are needed to help preserve or strengthen your organization's financial, operational, and programmatic viability? We generally think about 3 different categories of actions that can be mixed and matched across any of the scenarios you developed. So the first category represents items that are no regrets moves. So the things you might pursue in any scenario. And many of you may have already started down this path. Here we're talking about things like reducing discretionary spending, making necessary investments to protect and support your staff, and proactively reaching out to funders or lenders. The second category is one that includes smaller scale flexible investments or cost reductions. For example, you may need to furlough staff due to a halted program. Other things that may fall into this category might be a reduction in executive compensation or in employee benefits. And then the third and last category involves larger scale, more permanent investments or cost reduction strategies. So, for example, you may need to lay off some of your staff who are not critical to preserving core programs. The actions you outline will likely have some economic cost or benefit. So, quantifying the potential costs incurred or savings achieved for each action individually over whatever time horizon the action would need to be implemented is an important part of this step. Then you would calculate the total estimated costs incurred or savings achieved by each set of actions for your best, moderate, and worst case scenarios. One last related point here is the use of reserves. If you haven't already, align with your leadership to determine when or how your financial reserves may be applied to cover anticipated funding gaps or fund critical investments. I'd love to pause here for a second just to get some input in the chat. What actions has your organization already taken to date? What no regrets moves have you pursued so far?
And we'll pause just for a minute.
Well,
Thank you. Yeah, adding in places where folks have already made no regrets decisions to address the scenarios they're facing, reaching out to funders in advance, crisis communication, keeping some positions vacant. Yeah, deferring planned capital improvements, reducing those improvements. it's helpful to see kind of where you all are at, and also that, you're not alone as leaders in making some of these hard choices right now. Here's an example of what I was just talking through, of really laying out the full list of actions and thinking through what category are they in? Are they no regrets moves, things that are flexible, which you might, pump the brakes if you need to, and then really more major changes. And you can also see, going through the exercise of how much will these cost, whether they actually have a cost to us or some cost savings, can be super useful. In this example, right, this organization would then know what to do, and when the time comes, um, what major moves they're going to make. And so the last step is to think through actually what are the signals that are going to help you as an organization make some of these moves. At which point will you pump the brakes for those flexible options? At which point will you make some of the major changes?
So in this step, you'll identify the key indicators and triggers that will help prompt decision making and action on the part of your leadership team. So at what point will you maybe decide to furlough or lay off which staff? When should you press pause on certain employee benefits like a retirement match? What will prompt you to shut down a program delivery site? And these are really tough questions and tough decisions. But these trigger points, whether signaled by internal metrics or external events, can serve as guardrails for you and your leadership team through the crisis and its aftermath. And they'll also help speed up decision making down the road. So, as noted on this slide, decision trigger points can take different forms. So, for example, it could be a date that prompts you to decide, or it could be an event. And so, a key tip here is that this is a great opportunity to establish or update, if you have it, your decision making processes and roles so that you're ready to act when needed.
Awesome. Thanks, Alma. And one note, I just saw in the comments, apologies from our side that we have the chat set up where you guys can't see each other chatting. For next time, we'll get that right so you can also see what the others are saying. But just to narrate a bit more what's in the chat, and I think we can also share the readout of the chat after with the webinar materials. The folks on the line, the 100 plus so of you chimed in with people are, you know, doing things like communicating with funders and elected officials regularly, updating policies, eliminating some extras, really finding ways to save costs now and also plan for the future. Let's go into our next piece. And this is really, we actually wanted to make some time for questions you have on this approach. And so there's a couple of questions in the Q&A already. And we'd love to invite others there as well. And we can start with kind of digging in on some of these as well. I see a question from Trina. I'm curious about why you only look at the economic cost, not the people cost, public relation cost, impact costs. No, that's a great point. And in the example we shared there, certainly a first pass is looking at just like the apples to apples financial costs and savings you might have from different actions. But I would definitely agree with you, Trina, that there's an opportunity to think about what are the costs in terms of people, in terms of our reputation, in terms of the impact as well when making some of these hard decisions, particularly with things like cutting back on staff or on benefits. There can be real cost to your culture and to the long-term health of your organization, to employee retention that then might impact your ability to do the work with impact. I see a couple of questions in the chat about the role of different stakeholders, staff, and the board, and can definitely speak to that. What we found works fairly well for like medium-sized nonprofits is to have a process that's driven by the leadership team, so executive director quite involved, as well as the other key leaders who collectively understand each part of the organization. And in the process of then going and getting input, what are the big scenarios we should be thinking about? What are the biggest opportunities? What are the biggest risks? That is a great place to tap into people like advisors and the board who can then, provide input to that list. Usually, in my experience, the set of decisions that an executive director might be making in regard to these unfolding scenarios would then, for the no regrets things, for the flexible opportunities, they're probably decisions that sit with the executive director anyways, and they might then update their board on. But for some of the really big extreme changes, those might actually be ones that the board is more involved in. So definitely thinking about, in the right context, case specific, what's the role of the board? At a minimum, I think providing input and then sharing back with them what the plan looks like. And if you get into some of those really big decisions, involving them in decision making as appropriate as well. We will share the resources. I see another question, the website link to the slides. We'll share those at the end, and everybody who registered for the webinar will also get a follow-up note. Any other questions for right now on this approach, on these tools that folks would add in? Great point again from Trina, just on, these scenarios shouldn't just be negative. A best case could actually be better than the current. Totally agree with you on that. Even in this current environment right now, we did a project with a nonprofit this summer who provides resources to school kids who don't have them. And they actually saw a big uptick in their small donor donations and in-kind contributions from corporations because their stakeholders were seeing, wow, inflation's going up, household costs are going up. This is an opportunity we have to give back and provide in-kind and cash donations to help kids in need. And so this organization actually on that front, in terms of resources and incoming funding, actually saw an increase as a result of all the changes going on. So yeah, totally agree. In the best case, there actually could be opportunities you look at as well. The other thing I'll say is when you go back to this page in thinking through what are the big drivers of impact and economics at risk, you might also in this thought exercise find areas of opportunity that are high likelihood and high magnitude that are also worth exploring, and not just from a downside, but from a way that you might be able to accelerate your impact. So I appreciate that. There's also a question in the chat. We talked a bit about, in particular, a focus on costs in step 3. And this person asks also about thinking about revenue drivers and other ways that you might try to increase revenue in response to the external environment. And totally agree that could also be in there, in particular, if as the world changes, there's some opportunities to take steps that might increase philanthropic support or increase earned revenue based on how things are unfolding. That's definitely a thing that you could think about in this context as well. So then just a couple of points to recap on applying this approach, and then we'll share some resources as well as a couple of links about just monitoring the external world. Amma, do you want to cover this?
Yes. So where to begin? Talking to the rest of your board and senior team, if relevant, is really critical. So this is not something to do alone, as we discussed in the Q&A. There's a lot of opportunities to bring in stakeholders, and doing this well means involving the right people across your leadership team at the right time. So ensure you involve those with knowledge of the critical inputs for your analysis. That might include those with an eye towards programs, towards funding, towards operations, and the key decision makers. And it's also important to seek outside counsel, in particular legal counsel, if you are unsure of your relative legal or reputational risk or related actions to take to mitigate those risks. And then, as we've discussed, start codifying the scenarios you've been thinking about already, and don't wait on the no regrets actions. We've voiced over some of the actions that some organizations are already taking. And it's really important to put those in place as quickly as possible. And then in addition, there are a lot of really great resources that you and your teams can take advantage of in this moment. First is Elevate Nonprofit's website, which has a growing selection of resources tailored to your needs. And then the Scenario Planning Toolkit, which we'll share a link to after this webinar, captures these same principles we talked about today and can help walk you and your teams through a scenario planning process. And then last is an up-to-date tracking of executive orders and related implications that the National Council of Nonprofits is maintaining. I saw there was a question in chat about how do you keep up when there's so much changing day to day. So this is an example of a helpful resource to that end. We've also found that many law firms are tracking and have published legal implications of executive orders for nonprofits. Um, and if anyone, given the size of our audience today, we also welcome you to drop in the chat any additional resources you found helpful in navigating this time, and we'll make sure to share those as we share the rest of what the takeaways from today.
Thank you, Amma. Yeah, feel free if there's specific resources you've been finding useful. It could be anything from like your favorite Substack on following current events as they change to specific tools and resources for nonprofits. And we'll make sure that those are captured and will be shared back as well. One last resource, if you want to hear more about, you can reach out and we can tell you more. But Bridgespan offers an online guided project for nonprofits called our Bridgespan Leadership Accelerator, which has a menu of 4 different projects on the topics you see here. It's a self-guided with opportunity to access a coach and office hours with a Bridgespan leader to talk through the topics of strategic clarity, creating an adaptive plan, etc. And in particular, the one on creating an adaptive plan and thinking about what's our 2-year plan, given how much the world is changing, the update on our strategy, what does that look like? We're enrolling a cohort of organizations for that program, which will start in January. And if you'd like more information, there's a link here and feel free to reach out. I'll hand it over to John to share a bit about some exciting new things coming up with Elevate NP.
Thanks, Mike. So one of the key parts of this process, as the team just shared, is that this is not something that you do in isolation. You bring in other members of your team. Sometimes it makes sense to bring in key board leaders, and sometimes it helps to have an outside perspective as a facilitator and a guide. So while today's content and the toolkit that the team shared are something that you can take and run with, we've put together a series of 3 in-person clinics that are really intended to provide a space to work through this process for executive directors and a member of their team, working alongside Mike, Amma, and Vlad from Bridgespan, the team from Elevate NP, and also a group of local consultants that have expressed an interest in participating. So these sessions will be taking place in November 18th, 19th, and 20th. To help try to make them accessible across our region, we're hosting them in 3 locations, one in Charleroi in Washington County, accessible to Mon Valley, one in Harmony in Butler County, and one in the north side of Pittsburgh. But all sessions are open to all organizations, regardless of location. The content of each session is the same. It's really intended to be a space to take some of the tools and approaches that we've talked about here today and put them into practice. We're anticipating to have a lot more demand than we will likely have space for. So we're asking interested organizations to complete a short application. The QR code here will take you to that application, which will also be on our website and sent out by email following today's webinar. The clinics will be run through the morning on each day. And so we'll get started with the content around 9:30. We'll networking and coffee break beforehand and aim to wrap up by 12:30. So it's really a half-day session at each. The target audience for these sessions are really small and mid-sized organizations, and we generally talk about that as a range of about 250,000 to 5 million in activity. But that's a loose range. So if you're a little bit below or a little bit above that, we'd still love to talk to you about participating. We're really looking for organizations that have at least a paid executive director for this first set of clinics. We're open to any mission or subsector, with the exception of organizations that focus exclusively on political advocacy. If you engage in some advocacy work, as I would expect just about everyone should be doing in the present moment, you're welcome to join. We're just not able to really accommodate folks who focus solely on political advocacy at this time. Organizations that are able to participate will have the option to bring another staff member or a board member, like we talked about during the content. It's really helpful to have a partner in working through these exercises. If we have enough demand, we'll look at hosting more sessions into the new year. So please take a look, express interest through that form, and reach out to our team if you have any questions. We want to have those applications by October 17th so that we can work through the logistics for those 3 sessions. We also have coming up in December, on December 2nd, another webinar with this team from Bridgespan on exploring nonprofit mergers and collaborations. We've gotten a lot of feedback in the last couple months. This is a topic that a lot of organizations are interested in pursuing. They maybe feel like they need to consider deeper partnerships and collaborations right now, but aren't sure where to start. And in some of the chat responses that, again, I'm sorry they weren't visible to everyone for today, but there were a number of folks as we asked some of those early questions that said, I'm interested in knowing whether or not we should be pursuing a merger or a deeper partnership or how we start that. So this session coming up on December 2nd from 12 to 1 is really digging a little bit deeper into your strategic options there. This QR code will take you to that website where more information, registration form is available. Again, those scenario planning clinics are November 17, 18, and 19 from 9:30 to, I'm sorry, November 18, 19, and 20 from 9:30 to 12:30. And the webinar is December 2nd from 12 to 1. So we still have about 15 minutes. So if there are other questions, feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A and we can take them either around the scenario planning content that Mike, Amma, and Vlad shared, or anything else about our upcoming programming on either the scenario planning clinics or the webinar in December. If you have questions after today, you can always reach out to info@elevatenp of SWPA. And I apologize, that should read .org on that slide. That QR code will also take you to our website, and we'll be sending out a short survey for everyone after today with a couple questions to help us refine our process, shape future content. As some of you might know, this is our first time hosting a webinar like this. We're still working out a few little kinks. Thank you for bearing with us. But please take a couple minutes to answer those survey questions when you get a chance. So I see a question coming in. If your organization's budget is more than 5 million, does this mean you don't qualify for the in-person sessions? If you're just over that threshold, please put in an application so we know you're interested and learn a little bit more about your organization. We'll accommodate you if you can. If you're from a much larger organization, someone who's a 10, 20, $30 million budget, we're really trying to prioritize the smaller folks right now who are just a little bit more buffeted by some of the changes right now. And again, this QR code here just takes you to our scenario planning page on our website, which will have the webinar recording, slides, and materials after today, as well as information about the upcoming programming. Thank you all for joining us. I don't see any other questions coming in. Mike, Amar, Vlad, any last words before we sign off?
No, just thanks so much. Hope to see some of you in November and look forward to rolling up sleeves and digging into some more of this then. Thanks so much, John and Elevate and Pete.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.